From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network, and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. And we're honored to be joined by Dan DiMicco, the controversial Trump tariffs that have just been put 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. And Dan DiMicco is a former CEO and chairman emeritus of Nucor, a company that was in deep trouble when he came aboard, but which has not had a single layoff in 40 years. He led Nucor to record profits. He was appointed to the U.S. Manufacturing Council in 2008 by the Secretary of Commerce. The Harvard Business Review included him in its 2010 top 100 best performing CEOs. And his book that he came out with a couple of years ago is American Made: Why Making Things Will Return Us to Greatness. A brilliant and great guy to talk with. And the greatness theme in his book is obviously moved over to the MAGA theme of Donald Trump's campaign. Welcome, Dan. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you, Jim. Great to be back. It's been a while.
Can you explain, first of all, you worked with the administration, didn't you, on getting these tariffs, looking into them and what should be done. Is that true?
Well, during the campaign, I was one of the senior trade advisors to the Trump campaign. And all of these issues and others dealing with trade and some of the economic policy issues were part of a group contribution that I was part of. Then I took on the role of lead for the USTR transition team, which is the U.S. Trade Representative, the cabinet position and department, and was in charge of that for 5 or 6 months until the president took office. Since then, I've been supporting Bob Lighthizer, the USTR. Recently, I was appointed to the ACTPN, which is a advisory committee for trade, promotion, and negotiations to the USTR. So I have been involved in all of these issues.
Very impressive. You probably worked with Peter Navarro then, too, who's a big person behind this. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk in particular is there's a lot of people that are skeptical of tariffs and whether they work. And I thought it was important to have someone that was been in the trenches because Dan obviously competed against the Chinese directly. Tell us, tariff wars, we're told, don't end well. Smoot-Hawley helped make the Depression a lot worse. Why are you confident this is a good decision? And maybe tell us, from firsthand what it was like competing against them.
Well, first off, part of your question, you mentioned a couple of issues. One of them is the fact that Smoot-Hawley had somehow contributed to the Great Depression. That particular issue has been debunked many times now, Jim. Okay. I could send you the information that clearly shows that Smoot-Hawley didn't happen until well after the Great Depression. And it was like 6 years afterwards or something like that. And it had nothing to do with the creation of the Great Depression. And in fact, really had no impact on imports, exports, to any negative effect, but people like to use that, and they throw it out there. Mm-hmm. So that's fact number one. Fact number two is we've been in a trade war since the 70s. Most recently, China has notched it up 10,000 times what the Japanese and the Germans did in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. China has been the major threat to our sovereignty, our national security, our economic strength. They've done everything to compromise not just the United States, but the world with stealing intellectual property, dumping products in a predatory fashion, and particularly with respect to steel. We went through a really rough time in 2000 to 2002 with a recession here, but also with massive shutdowns of U.S. steelmaking capacity, 30 32 to 38 plants were shut down, it was a terrible time. And we went to the president at that time, President Bush, and he put in place a 201 tariff of 30% on all steel. Mm-hmm. And that was in place for 18 months, the purpose of which was to give the industry an opportunity to consolidate, to restructure, and to be able to get back on its feet because of the predatory pricing that had destroyed the pricing in the U.S. market and put all these companies out of business. And it worked. I will follow up by just saying the International Trade Commission did a study after the fact, and there was no net job losses because of it, and there was no measurable impact on the GDP. So all these things you're hearing are all chicken little skies falling, non-facts.
Let me ask you,
just people trying to, make it sound like it's going to be the end of the world.
Okay, so were the Chinese dumping steel on us at below their cost?
Oh yeah, way below their cost, way below their own home market prices, which is illegal according to our own trade laws and to the laws of the and rules of the WTO. In 2000, they had about 100 million tons of steelmaking capacity, maybe 150. Over the preceding 13 years, they built about 1 billion tons of steelmaking capacity. They declared the steel industry a strategic industry necessary for their industrialization and military strength and economic strength in the early 2000s. And then they managed to build that massive capacity in a non-market economy that is virtually all government-owned. And so what we found ourselves doing here and around the world, not just the United States, is competing with the state-owned enterprises that had no profit motive. They were strictly there to build on their industrial might, build on their military might, build up their infrastructure, and create a lot of jobs in China. They dumped their excess production in the world, took steel prices down to levels way below the cost of most steel producers globally, and did a lot of harm and continue to do a lot of harm over the period from 2008 after the Great Recession through to today.
Is it the fact that we're exempting Canada and Mexico, who are bigger net exporters to us? Is that bad, good? How do you see that?
Well, basically, most countries in the world, in fact, really all of them that have a steel industry, are enabling China to distort the global steel market and destroy pricing through predatory practices. And Canada and Mexico, the EU, are no exception. Mm-hmm. There are products that get made in China that get repackaged, get some processing done to them, and then come in through all those countries into the U.S. market, mislabeled, mismarked, and originating as Chinese product.
So I think that they're about 4% of steel imports, and so my question is it that impactful, or are they doing a lot of transshipment to sleazy get around that?
Yeah, you are hitting the real nail on the head here. First off, the 4% number is fictitious.
Okay.
It's fictitious because of the amount of circumvention and transshipment of steel that originates in China that ends up in our market and ends up in other markets in the world. The problem with the global overcapacity, in the world today, we have about 2.3 billion tons of capacity, 2.3 billion, and about 1.6 to 1.7 billion of demand. Virtually 600 million tons of excess capacity have been brought on by China. So here's the way it works. We've won a lot of cases directly against China on trade, countervailing duty and anti-dumping cases. So have Europe and the rest of the world. But they are masters at repackaging, transshipping, and circumventing those rulings. And the second part is, if you have China exporting steel to other countries in the world, because of the overcapacity that exists in the world, it displaces the sales of those tons from those steel companies in those other countries. And so China sends their tons in. Those other steel companies and countries look for a place to sell their steel, and the truly only open market in the world is the United States, has been the United States. And so it all comes in here, but China indirectly pushes it from other countries into our market. So to say that they only are 4% of the problem is a complete inaccurate and basically a lie.
And Stan DiMicco, former CEO, and working with the Trump administration on the new Trump tariffs to try and equal things up. We're talking with Dan DiMicco, who's former CEO of Nucor Steel, so he knows the business on the ground. He's had to compete against the Chinese when they were dumping steel product into the U.S., and he's worked with the Trump administration in the campaign and on architecting these, on recommending these tariffs. Do you worry about retaliation? I'm told that they could retaliate in areas like soybeans, aircraft, car parts, machinery. They could go for French Airbus instead of Boeing. Do you worry about any of that?
Well, listen, nobody likes the idea of retaliation. But, again, we've been in a trade war for many decades, and it's gotten to a critical point now where we have an $800 billion trade deficit in goods. Forget the services industry. Whatever surplus we have there, while a good thing, is not important and critical to our national security, our national defense, and our ability to be a world leader. And so this $800 billion in trade deficit is totally out of control, and it's got to be reduced dramatically. And so the war has been waged on us, principally by China, but not without the enabling by other countries, allowing China to get away. The WTO has done nothing to rein China's trade mercantilism and predatory pricing in. They've been basically worthless in that regard, which is the greatest threat to free trade and global trade the world has ever seen. And so, you know, we're in a war, and it's time for us to stand up and say enough's enough. If that begets retaliation, we'll have to deal with it.
All right,
my own personal opinion, Jim, is they've got more to lose than we do. We have an $800 billion trade deficit in goods. That means everybody else has got a surplus. Who is going to end up on the short end of the stick at the end of this whole thing? It's going to be the people that have the surpluses, not the people that have the trade deficits, which is us.
Well, let me ask you this, because this is one thing that really bothers me. The estimated cost of the intellectual property and industrial espionage that they do, China, that steal from us, is $300 billion a year. How do we get at that?
Well, this is all part of what the president is doing with his massive trade reform and accountability package and plans. There's the USTR, at the president's request, is working on a 301 trade case that is directed specifically at intellectual property theft and the blackmail that's used by the Chinese to get American multinationals to turn over their IP to them as a condition of having any business ventures in China, not let alone what they steal from us, okay, which is well known throughout the world. It's not something that I'm making up by any means. So that $300+ billion every year, that's on top of the trade deficit. That's on top of the $800 billion. Okay, and that is a very critical thing. And so, let me just go back to one thing really quick on the Canadian thing. I think the president will get them to work with us more on China, and they will work to get them to stop the trade transshipment and circumvention that goes on through their country, and that's how they retain their exclusion, which is only in place for 30 days at present. So, that I just wanted to get back to that because you asked me that question before you took a little break. Let
me ask you this: all the economists, et cetera, who think that tariffs are dumb and a big mistake, Do you feel they're just not in touch the way that you are, who have lived through this?
That's an understatement. All of these guys who are either economists or folks doing the bidding of multinationals who've made major bets in China, the economists push the whole idea of free trade. The problem is free trade was never designed to compete with trade mercantilism and predatory trading practices. Free trade doesn't exist in the world. It only exists in their classrooms. It only exists in their books of theory. The empirical reality is free trade has been destroyed by trade mercantilism, which is what is destroying the U.S. steel industry, aluminum industry, solar panel industry, soon to be aerospace industry, semiconductor industry. China has come out with a 2020 program that basically says we will dominate the world in all these industries, plus the new artificial intelligence.
Wow.
And they'll do it the same way they're doing with steel, is they'll cheat their way into it.
Are we, by pulling out of the TPP, are we going to end up better, you think, getting better leverage negotiating-wise, or what's the logic there?
The TPP was a terrible, terrible giveaway. What ended up happening, maybe it started out as a good idea, but the push to get it done in a hurry put us in a position of just giving away the farm, all right? And President Trump knew that, and we all knew that, and that's why he did away with it as soon as he came in. The process that President Trump is working on now to make America great again includes 4 key steps: tax reform, trade reform, regulatory reform, energy reform, and an infrastructure approach. All of those things work together in a synergistic way to get us to be, make America great again, to put our economy on a long-term positive trajectory, to get our deficits down, and to rebuild our lost leadership positions in the industries critical to any country that wants to be a global leader.
That was well said, and it's not really well known how much progress they've made on the deregulation side. Final thing, do you believe that a manufacturing renaissance is still possible, and is that the key to getting the middle class, the stagnancy over and income equality started to be addressed?
The answer to that is yes and yes. There's new technology, innovations coming all the time that enable all of our business industries to be more productive, more efficient. So, yes, a manufacturing renaissance. I mean, Nucor, the steel company that I was CEO and chairman of for 13 years, is the most efficient steel producer in the world. Nobody's better. Nobody can compete with us on a level playing field and beat us by not even close. So there's no reason why we should. It's not like nobody's using steel in the world or aluminum or or solar panels. They're all over the place. What we got to do is get our fair share of that back here by stopping the cheating that's taking that away from us. And then we have to make sure that whatever intellectual property we develop here, we keep here, doesn't get stolen, doesn't get blackmailed away from us, okay, so that we can use that to rebuild our manufacturing sector in an even more efficient and productive way and be a country that, once again, has a strong manufacturing base that is key to any leadership position that we will occupy in the world. China gets it. That's why they've been doing everything they can to get there themselves, including cheating on every rule and every agreement they ever had with the WTO or the United States on favored nation trading status. Enough's enough, Jim.
Dan, always a pleasure, and I know what a patriot you are and how much you put into this, and realizing we got to make some things back in this country, and it's got to be done fairly. Dan, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jim. Anytime, my friend.
Bye-bye. today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Stephen Roach is a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and the School of Management at Yale. Prior to that, he was chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. For the bulk of his career on Wall Street, he was the chief economist at Morgan Stanley, and he also worked on the research staff of the Federal Reserve Board before that. Welcome, Steve. Good to talk to you this morning.
Great to be with you, Jim.
And the book is contrarian in nature in the sense that it's not a China-bashing book. I'll ask you, why did you write the book? And then get right to the mirror images as you describe the two economies.
Well, Jim, I spent the bulk of my Wall Street career trekking back and forth between my focus on the U.S. and my more recently growing focus on China. And just came to believe that there were so many misperceptions about this relationship that I needed to, one, develop a framework to better understand it, and number two, find a platform, which I found at Yale, to really articulate a different take on that relationship. And the book is very much a reflection of that journey.
Okay, what exactly do you mean by the pathology of codependency?
Well, codependency is a term I borrow from the study of human psychology. Two individuals in a relationship that depend too much on each other for their own sense of self. And it's not a stable relationship. The dependency ultimately leaves the individuals hollow, lacking a sense of identity, frictions, imbalances, and if not treated, ultimately a breakup. And it struck me that the United States and China are very much locked into an uncomfortable codependency right now. It initially began as a marriage of convenience in the late 70s, early 80s, when both economies were needy, and they turned to each other to sustain new sources of economic growth. America provided China with the largest market for its export-led economy, and China provided the United States with cheap goods, cheap capital, open-ended buying of treasuries that enabled us to grow without saving and helped us finance our budget deficits. And it all seemed to work very well. And then, both economies took these models too far, and they're now dealing and confronting significant imbalances.
And part of our weakness is what you call false prosperity. The fundamental insight in the book is the need that these economic models need overhaul. Talk briefly about the false prosperity and that leading to the economic models needing overhaul, what you mean by both of those.
Look, everybody wants growth because growth is the sustenance of improved income, jobs. It's the essence of prosperity. But if you can cut corners and get growth without really doing the heavy lifting of relying on your fundamentals, you get into trouble. And I think that's what happened to both economies. The United States took its model to excess in the 90s and in the 2000s, relying increasingly on asset bubbles, credit bubbles, equity, property, and squandered its saving, created massive current account international payments imbalances, and ultimately when the bubbles popped, the false prosperity came home to roost. China, to its credit, drove the export-led growth model to levels that no one had ever done, but a large part of that export-led impetus was based on the bubbles that were driving consumption in the West, especially the United States. So China, in many respects, also had a flirtation and a dangerous one with false prosperity. And now China is changing its model. It's moving away from the export model to more of a internal consumer demand model, and there are major consequences for the United States if it does not appreciate or understand that.
What degree do you think we've squandered our global leadership position?
Well, I think we still remain the world's largest economy, but that'll change in the next 5 to 10 years. China will surpass us in terms of overall GDP.
5 to 10 years, that quick?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I mean,
wow.
They're a large economy right now, and if they stay on the path they're on, and many doubt that, I think the overtake could certainly be by 2025 or possibly even sooner.
Wow.
On a per person basis, though, which is more relevant,
Yeah.
engaging the living standards of a nation, we're talking about a convergence that is decades and decades much further into the future.
Okay, talking China bashing here, one of the big issues is currency manipulation. Where are you on that issue, and are there other issues that you think are of a more real nature?
Look, China manages its currency. In other words, it doesn't want to let the renminbi or the yuan, as many refer to it, rise sharply. As a developing economy with an embryonic financial system, I think that's a wise and judicious position. But its currency has been rising, contrary to what the China bashers who scream and yell about currency manipulation say. The renminbi is up about 34% since the middle of 2005. That's a 3 to 4% increase a year. It's a lot higher than most people thought. On a broad basis, China's currency compared to all of its major trading partners, it's up to close to 40% over that same period. It might have been higher. It's hard to say if the currency had been fully convertible, freely floating in foreign exchange markets, as the technical jargon would have you describe it. But the path that the Chinese officials have taken, I think, is very much commensurate with a development strategy that has to be cautious in opening up China's markets and economies to broad market forces.
Other issues? Property rights, cyber hacking?
Look, there are plenty of issues in China. There are plenty of issues in all economies. There's a property bubble that the government is addressing right now. I think they're making progress on that regard. They've incurred too much debt since the crisis of 2008 and 2009, and the central bank is trying to rein in the excesses of debt-intensive growth. Sure, there are cyber hacking disputes, but who are we to call the kettle black here? I mean, we have some problems with cyber hacking on our own count in the United States that are completely out of control. The two nations need to come to terms in addressing this very important issue. There are human rights issues. There are governance issues. There are electoral reform and judicial reform issues, all of which need attending, and the government certainly needs to embrace agendas that make progress in those areas.
How bad is the intellectual property rights and the alleged stealing of those? I know they're talking about the iPhone 6 already being a black market product over there.
Well, I think there's a lot of rumors out there about various aspects on the dark side of China. I have no knowledge whatsoever if the iPhone 6 is out there. Quite honestly, I think my own experience is that enforcement of intellectual property has improved. It still has a long way to go. I'd be pretty shocked to see if there was a black market iPhone 6 out there right now, but anything is possible. I think the courts are being more proactive and cooperative in dealing with intellectual property issues inside of China as China moves to develop its own brands, both in manufacturing and expertise in services. It knows full well that it is incumbent upon it to also demand protection for its own intellectual property that it creates.
We've got about a minute to go. We did a show recently on President Nixon, the tapes that are out. And one of the things he says is China's a lot less rigid, more nuanced than Russia to negotiate. How do you find negotiating with the Chinese?
Well, I think I've been surprised since I've been spending a lot of time in China over the last 15 years about the nuances. There certainly are areas that are difficult to get through with the Chinese, but they've been pretty savvy in being able to expand the boundaries of freedom and negotiation over years, knowing full well as they grow that there's going to be pushes both internally and externally for broader boundaries, whether it has to do with economic issues, financial issues, social, and ultimately even political issues.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell, coming to you on the Business Talk Radio Network, over 300 stations across the country. We'll be right back. We'll talk about how we got to where we are today. And we're talking about the precarious state of China-U.S. relations with Stephen Roach. In this segment, The Way Out. You mentioned this briefly, but I just want to start off with this. We always talk the Roman Empire, military overreach, and then too much debt. Do you think that we are on that path seriously, and is there a serious threat of the U.S. dollar being replaced as the reserve currency?
Look, I think we need to take a deep look inside of ourselves and figure out, what is it that we want out of our economy on a longer-term basis. We've sort of become, the here and now generation where we want instant gratification, and this is true of the Congress and their inability to deal with budget deficits, but it's also true of American consumers who are more than willing to go into debt up to their eyeballs just to fund current consumption, but they don't save anymore, and they've been led down the road to believe that they could save out of equity bubbles first, then property bubbles, and cheap credit enables them to take on as much debt. This is not a way to run the economy, and if we stay on this path, I think we're going to be in trouble over the longer haul in just having the wherewithal to fund our long simmering needs, whether it's respect to Medicare, retirement, or even basic needs of infrastructure, our manufacturing prowess in the world. So I'm not saying we're a nation that's about to go down the tank like Greece, but the long-term outlook is problematic if we don't attend to the fundamentals, especially saving, that underpins the success of any nation.
Okay, we've done the bad dream. Let's talk about the best case, your mutual restructuring. And it's not revolutionary in nature, just the U.S. needs to go, you figure, from 69 to 64% consumer percentage of GDP. Tell us the way out.
Look, I think the way out is to recognize that we've pushed our growth model too far. We're unbalanced. I mean, we don't have somebody who talks about the four uns like Wen Jiabao did, but we're definitely unbalanced, unstable, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. And so we need to look to different sources of economic growth. And if we save more, we can take that saving, recycle it in the form of investing in human capital, physical capital, rebuilding our competitiveness agenda, and we can turn more to things like exports and capital spending, investments in technologies, to drive our prowess. And as we become more competitive as exporters, who better to sell America goods, services, and know-how to the Chinese, which are going to be expanding their consumer base at a pace that the world has never seen. So the optimistic scenario, and I end this book on the optimistic scenario, is that the rebalancing of America and China fit each other like a glove. And rather than view China as a threat, we need to view the next China, which is a consumer-led, services-led China, as an opportunity that fits perfectly into our competitive prowess. But if all we want to do is consume with instant gratification, we're not going to see that. We're going to miss it, and we're going to squander what I think will be one of the greatest growth opportunities the world will ever see.
In fact, you calculate the China services opportunity alone is potentially $4 trillion.
Well, the Chinese services sector is going to expand by about $13 trillion between now and 2025. The tradable portion of that, and more services because of the internet are now tradable, is somewhere between $4 and $6 trillion. And who better to have the opportunity to participate in that than the world's most competitive services economy, the United States. So shame on us if we don't seize that moment.
And in talking about fitting hand in glove, the more China moves to consumer and service, I would assume the better it is for their pollution problem.
Well, services certainly don't have anything close to the carbon footprint than manufacturing and construction. And so there certainly will be some reduction in the carbon intensity of their GDP as they move to services, but they need to do a lot more. They're not moving out of the manufacturing business, and they're still hugely inefficient when it comes to the consumption of energy per unit of GDP, and 70% of their energy shows up in the form of coal, which is the dirtiest of all the fuels. So the Chinese have a horrific pollution problem, and with global consequences. And they know this. They're trying to address it, but their ability to be successful in that regard so far has been disappointing.
Okay, as we get down towards the end of the national segments, what we've been is a kick the can down the road culture for a long time now. Do you have a probability of the your best case scenario working out versus the worst case?
Yeah, I think right now the odds, given the lay of the land politically and the policies that we're still embracing in terms of extraordinarily low, if not non-existent, zero interest rates, I still think the scenario where the U.S. stays with its old model and China changes its new model, what I call an asymmetrical rebalancing scenario, I'd give those 2-1 over the more constructive outcome, which is a sort of a symmetrical rebalancing where not only does China change from exports to consumption, but we start to tone down our consumption, save more, and reinvest that saving. I wish the odds were higher, but again, I'm looking for the leadership who has the guts to lay out a strategy like that to the American people.
If we come out on the downside of that asymmetrical relationship, how bad is that?
Well, it's just another reason why economic growth is going to be a struggle in the decades ahead. The asymmetrical rebalancing, where China changes and we don't, means our interest rates will be higher, our dollar will be weaker, inflation will be lower, and those are all headwinds to economic growth. And so for an economy that's historically grown 3%, the risk is, we could grow half of that over the next 10 to 20 years.
Let's get down to the last minute and a half. As we go through QE taper, is that beginning of raising interest rates and maybe a little tougher challenges a good way to start forcing us to make tough choices, or we're going to be looking for an easy way out?
Well, I think you put your finger on a big issue of debate. Nobody wants quantitative easing to end because they're hooked on sort of the sugar high of low interest rates and what that does for financial markets. But QE, in my respect, to borrow the phraseology of quantitative easing, is a disaster waiting to happen. It didn't do anything to the real economy. It didn't do anything to really cure the labor market. It did boost financial markets, and especially the rich people who own the bulk of the equity in those markets. And the sooner we get out of these policies and get back on facing up to our fundamental challenges, the better.
Okay, that book again is Unbalanced, The Codependency of America and China, published by Yale University Press. Thanks for joining us, everybody. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is Segment 5 Overtime. That's exclusively for Yale Radio, WYBC. We thank Steve Roach for agreeing to stay on. And right off where we left off after QE taper, one change in our favor as we're looking forward is growing energy independence with fracking and all this oil we're finding within the U.S., natural gas. How could we leverage off of that, and is that something that we should be using as leverage against both Russia and China, particularly Russia, probably?
Look, Jim, I think this technological effort in the energy production area is just an example of some of the stuff that America is so outstanding at. We're great at innovation. We're terrific at putting entrepreneurs behind the innovation and commercializing it and using it to our competitive advantage. But the broader question is this going to be enough to really offset some of these other stiff headwinds that are bearing down on us. I don't think we can frack our way back to prosperity. I think we've got to do a lot more than that, and I think we're still facing down the road a lot of pressures bearing down on our long-term growth rate if we don't get our broad saving and other structural issues under better control. Can we use energy as a tool, as a force to negotiate against Russia? We absolutely can. Russia's a sort of a one-dimensional economy where oil, energy is the essence of its own economic prowess, and to the extent that we have alternative sources that would force prices lower, that would certainly be challenging for the Soviet Union.
What do you sense?
Not Soviet Union, Russia.
What do you think well, he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. What do you think the feeling is inside Chinese leadership about that trillions of dollars of Treasury's inventory?
Well, look, China didn't stumble into this massive accumulation of foreign exchange reserves by accident. It really arose out of the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, when country after country in Asia was obliterated by the first global crisis, in large part because they didn't have this foreign exchange backstop to deal with international pressures. So China has built up in the ensuing nearly 20 years a record over $4 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. Probably half of them are in dollar-based assets. The reason they buy dollars to a disproportionate share is because they manage their currency in a relatively judicious way to appreciate gradually against the dollar. If they chose to manage it, say, relative to the euro or the yen, then they would have much more in the way of euro or yen-denominated assets. But they have not done that because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. I think they're uncomfortable with this. They do not want to be overly dependent on any nation, especially a nation like the United States, where there are some tensions and frictions in the relationship that are at risk of bubbling over. But until they introduce reforms that make their currency less dependent on the dollar, then they are also pretty much hooked on accumulating more treasuries.
In the recent short term, the dollar is actually up a little bit versus the euro and the renminbi. Is that good or bad?
Well, the dollar has appreciated sharply in recent weeks and months as it becomes increasingly evident that the Federal Reserve is now pretty much made up its mind to exit this quantitative easing and begin to introduce the prospects of normalizing or raising interest rates. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank is going the other way. The European economy is in terrible shape, and the European Central Bank has laid out the possibility that it is likely to go down the road of quantitative easing. So the interest rate differential, dollar versus euro, suddenly looks much more favorable to dollar-based assets, and hence the bid on the dollar.
Talking about survival of the euro, do you think it will survive? Is it a good thing? I mean, you look at it, and in recent years, it allowed the Greeks obviously access to money at rates that were closer to German versus their own economy. Maybe it allowed them to delay restructuring and et cetera. What about the future of the euro and how you get that to work?
Well, that's a point I raise in the book, is that the euro was designed to integrate a continent that had been torn by just horrific wars for the significant periods of the 20th century, and by providing a single currency that was pretty much benchmarked on the old Deutschmark and the French franc, the so-called peripheral economies in the South, which were much weaker, like Greece and Spain and Portugal and even Italy, could enjoy the German and French interest rates, and that gave them sort of an easy way out. It gets back to the point of false prosperity. I mean, if if you're an uncompetitive economy like, say, Greece, and lo and behold, you can borrow in international capital markets at German interest rates, what's the big deal of running big deficits if you can fund them at ridiculously low interest rates? So Greece didn't fix its problems, and then when those interest rates started to rise during the crisis, suddenly Greece said, oh my gosh, we've got a problem. So I think the euro stays together, but I think the message of the aftershocks of the great financial crisis, which have turned into Europe's own crisis, are that there's no free lunch. You can't ride the wave of prosperity that is underwritten by others without getting your own house in order.
Would if Scotland had voted for independence, would that have been a disaster?
Well, I think it would have really sent a strong signal that the idea of economic integration and unification is one that voters, that citizens challenge. It may have just been a special case, but for Europe, where the costs of integration have been raised repeatedly during these last 5 years, first by the Greeks, then by some of the separatists in Spain. That could have been a sort of a tough example to see unfold before their very eyes.
If we move back to Asia and your expertise there as well, when I came out of college and then business school, started at IBM, there was paranoia in the senior leadership about Japan and Japan taking over the world. And we see they instead ended up in a malaise for over 20 years. How do you fix Japan? Well,
the Japan example is exactly what happens if you mismanage your economic model. Japan, with the benefit of hindsight, and I teach this at one of my courses at Yale called The Lessons of Japan, really had an unsustainable growth model that was based on currency manipulation, building up a lot of excess foreign exchange reserves, industrial policies that picked winners and losers, and a small elite that controlled the direction of the economy, and banks that were in bed with the industrial planners. And when the Japanese were forced to raise the value of the yen in the mid-'80s under the Plaza Accord, they countered with an aggressive monetary easing, which launched these bubbles, which then imploded and brought the economy down, and it's been down ever since. The new Abenomics is designed to finally address this, but ultimately it goes back to the same points we've been discussing today. There are three planks to the Abenomics prescription, 3 arrows as they call them in a more, the Japanese culture, monetary quantitative easing, fiscal policy, and structural reforms. And they've been very aggressive on the monetary plank. They've done something on the fiscal plank, but they've done very little on the structural issues. And so until they address their structural issues, these types of quick fix solutions that have been so favored in the U.S. and now in Europe, they just have lasting staying power in Japan. And so it's hard to be as enthusiastic about Japan finally getting out of its lost decades as many are.
Did you think that Japan was the threat that it looked like back then, or you saw this sort of mismanagement as inherent?
No, I think Japan in the in the late 1980s was a very powerful place, and I think it was sort of ironic that both Japan and Germany, the two powers that really lost World War II, were on the ascendancy and had economic models that had features that many of us in the West, myself included, really thought were powerful and lasting. But what happened at the very end of the 80s, I felt, and many others did, was not sustainable, as Japan then became the bubble economy, the first of the big bubble economies, and the value of the property, the value of the equity market went to such excess that it was only a matter of time before that was to end.
Well, let's talk about bubble economies. Do you think that back right about now that we've been looking like we're heading back to that? Now, I know the stock market may have recently started to prick that. I get your opinion on that. And also you say in the book, interestingly, to me at least, that the Fed should have more of a stability responsibility role as well.
Well, I'm just a big believer that if we allow, first of all, there are always going to be bubbles. You can't run policies to prick asset bubbles, but from time to time there are really big bubbles that end up distorting the economy and end up creating excesses of leverage for the system as a whole. And we knew that was the case in the late 90s. We knew that was the case in the mid-2000s, and we should have done something about it. And the Federal Reserve deliberately and consciously turned the other way and just said, we'll deal with it after the fact. And Greenspan, in a celebrated speech, after the equity bubble popped, right before he was leading us down the road to the Great Crisis, said that we feel vindicated in our approach in cleaning up after the mess of the bursting of the equity bubble. This is no way to run a central bank, and so I do believe that central banks need to be held accountable for maintaining monetary policy, not just for fostering full employment and price stability, but also for maintaining financial stability and avoiding these types of carnages that nearly brought us to our knees in 08 and 09.
We interviewed Steve Forbes recently, and he doesn't think that the Fed should even be touching the employment side of things. He doesn't buy the Phillips curve, which says a little bit of inflation's good for employment. Where are you on that?
Well, I do think the Fed, I'm sort of sympathetic to the fact that the Fed needs to be more disciplined, in some cases more rules-based, in laying out prescriptive norms that keep the economy on an even keel. I don't buy people who say the Fed should target monetary policy to maintain a stable price of gold or some basket of commodities or things of that sort. I think that's an approach that has outlived any semblance of usefulness. But the idea that the central bank is out there to support financial markets, which is very much the Greenspan, Bernanke prescription, I think creates the risk for a lot of accidents down the road. And I think Janet Yellen actually gets that, but it's hard for her to frame a different approach without being too critical of what the Fed has been doing over the last 25 years.
And interesting between the two countries, China and U.S., is we both increasingly have income inequality problems. There are a lot of rural movement to urban, a lot of poverty there, not enough jobs. And in the U.S., we obviously know the situation there. Have you got some sort of a prescription there?
I don't think so. I think inequality. What's interesting, you talk about the U.S. and China. Two systems at different ends of the ideological spectrum, and yet they both are afflicted with these serious problems of income and increasingly wealth inequality. How much of this is a natural outgrowth of the hyper technologies that we use and the wealth that creates for a few as opposed to many remains to be seen. But this is a worldwide problem. Jim, one thing I will say is that by embracing strategies like quantitative easing, which inject so much liquidity into financial markets, the bulk of the holdings of financial markets are to wealthy individuals. And so, if anything, in an era of quantitative easing, income inequalities get worse, not better.
One thing I'm intrigued about is this just complete inability of government to do any kind of strategic planning. I know that people right away think, oh, that's communist or socialistic, but corporations in America do strategic restructuring all the time. Is there some sort of institutional fix that we can bring in, or is it merely we need the leadership?
I think ultimately it's a question of leadership. I really do. I think we have leaderships that are very much driven by short-term political cycles and the whole campaign funding conundrum, and I think that's a problem that puts a huge price on getting leaders to step up with a long-term vision that may not go over all that well with the focus groups that give you instant gratification feedback as a politician. But this is, if there's ever been a time for leadership in the U.S. that can look beyond the near term, this is it. And I wish I could say there's somebody out there with the guts to do it, but that's what we have elections for.
Well, talking about the guts to do it, we elected someone that had a chance to be a transformational president. I personally was hoping he was going to do the Nixon in China domestically. He walked away from Simpson-Bowles, which was a long-term plan to restructure. I don't know if that gets to failed presidency, but why hasn't he been more of a transformational president?
You'll have to get him on your program, Jim, and ask him. Those are good questions. It's the same questions that I raise. And that many raise. It takes something special to go from running an effective campaign to really being a strategic, courageous, visionary leadership. If you're governing just with an idea towards winning the next political battle and toward preserving the incumbency stature of your office in your party, you're not going to get from point A to point B. You need to really put aside the politics and really do what's right for the long-term health and prosperity of the nation and its people. And we need presidents who can do that.
Now, your conceptual model for U.S.-China relations, it's a win-win on both sides. Do you get a sense that either potential presidential candidates or leaders in Washington understand what you're saying and realize what's going on there?
Look, I've had conversations with a lot of politicians over this, and some of them get it intellectually, and unfortunately, many of them who get it intellectually will sort of look at me and say, but politically, it's not workable for us to embrace the Chinese, and that's too bad, because I think the subtext here is that the strategic decisions about economic relationships are being made on the basis of short-term political considerations rather than on what is in the better interest of the country over the longer haul.
What about if we don't want to embrace China publicly, embracing more savings and incentives for people to save more, whether it's IRA derivatives or something?
Look, savings is again the essence of long-term prosperity for any nation. President Obama, to his credit, in his State of the Union address earlier this year, did introduce some savings incentives for low and middle income individuals, but that's a drop in the bucket. We need to do a lot more in terms of really boosting the long-term saving, expanding IRAs and 401ks, and actually getting the Federal Reserve back to a more normal interest rate policy that gives savers a market-based return rather than zero return.
Do we leave this with you somewhat optimistic? I know you said 2-1, the muddling through scenario is.
Look, I think the potential for constructive engagement between the United States and China on economic terms is fabulous. The odds of us realizing that potential right now are not where I would like them to be, and I think that over the months and years ahead, we need to make a key decision on whether or not we want to view the coming transformation of China as a threat or an opportunity. And in the same sense, we have to recognize what our needs are, and can we stay the course with our old model, or do we need a new model? And would that new model work better with what China is about to embark on? And if we can think about those decisions, I think we can frame this relationship in a more constructive way. That's not to say we should look aside at things that China's doing that we don't like and that we know full well are at odds with our value proposition. And we need to be tough in many of those areas, whether it's cyber, environment, human rights. But there's so much to be gained in putting the economic relationship on constructive terms that it would be really tragic if we were to squander that.
And in fact, what you're saying in many ways is we need to be honest with ourselves about what the facts are first. I want to thank Stephen Roach. The book, again, Unbalanced, The Codependency of America and China. And now, if the audience will indulge me for a bit, I'd like to comment on the passing recently of Andrew Madoff. Normally we like to take on Wall Street and Washington on this show, and obviously I've done several shows on the Madoff Ponzi scheme, investigated it pretty deeply, got to know Andrew Madoff, who was very open with me in an off-the-record sense because of all the legal issues, and I've come to know his mom, Ruth Madoff, fairly well. And in the short version of my thinking, 27 million documents have come out related to this scheme, and there has been no smoking gun in any way with Andrew Madoff or Ruth Madoff. Mark Madoff I did not know, but I believe the same could be said for him. And if you look at how they initially reacted, I think that's the best common sense example. And when Bernie Madoff first told the family, their reaction wasn't that they had some knowledge of it and that it was coming to an end, or that they should try to cover it up, or that they should try to move their money or things like that before reporting it. No, they actually left the scene, went right to lawyers to figure out how to report this to the SEC and the FBI. They were shocked. They were stunned. Andrew Madoff never spoke another word to his father after that time, and has said that, basically it left the family with Mark being in a quick death mode and him being in a slower motion death mode. And in a sense, they're the victims of epic betrayal. Now, I don't want to compare that to the victims that lost all that money. We've had on this show the coordinator for the coalition of Madoff victims, Ronnie Sue Ambrosino, and who was a middle-class person who lost most of her money, her and her husband's money. And in fact, I told Andrew about her. He was willing to reach out to her if she wanted. There's going to be no court that will clear Andrew Madoff's name. I know that he has some beautiful kids, and I know Ruth Madoff, so I just like to say that from my perspective, he was a person of character, and that I do not believe he was in any way involved or had knowledge of it. And I hope, for the sake of his family, who will not get an official clearance, I hope he rests in peace. And I appreciate the audience giving me a few seconds to say this about Andrew Madoff's passing. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated on the Biz Talk Radio Network. Podcasts of this 60-minute commercial-free version will be available right after we get off the air at YaleRadio, WYVC.com, or on iTunes. Search Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks again to Steve Roach. Thanks to our loyal Yale Radio audience for listening. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.